Check that out. My new Baltic Porter. If you want to know how to brew your own at home, keep watching. Now, a Baltic Porter is a difficult beer to pull off. It's a lager, so it is going to finish fairly dry, and you do want it fairly clean in terms of its ester profile, but it's got to feel luxurious, it's got to feel opulent. At the same time, you don't want it too sweet, too cloying. You want it to finish dry so that it's still drinkable. So we'll talk about how we're going to make that happen. It's a high gravity beer. This beer I'm aiming for 7.5%. So let's start by talking about the grist. I'm going to begin with a 50-50 mix of Barrett Burston Extra Pale Border Malt and Munich Malt. 5 kilograms of each. This malt backbone will give a slightly toasty, rounded, malty base to build upon without overwhelming the beer completely. Then we're going to add 250 grams of medium crystal malt to give a bit of caramel toffee sweetness. 250 grams of Shepherd's Delight, which will bring us into that cola fruitcake type malt complexity. Then we're going to add 100 grams of light or pale chocolate malt to give a bit of colour and nutty character, maybe even a hint of light cocoa to the finished beer. Finally, we're going to add some roasted wheat malt, which is a bit like carafa if you're familiar with that. Because wheat has no husk, it doesn't bring any of that roast dark astringency that you might get from, say, roasted barley or dark chocolate malt. What we're hoping to achieve by adding this is a little hint of coffee flavor and some color to the finished beer without that strong astringent dark roast character that you might get in a big stout. So it's a pretty big grain bill there. We're up at 10.7 kilos total. And I'm shooting for an original gravity of 10.073 by using a single infusion mash. I'm going to use a mash temperature of 70 degrees Celsius to maximize the dextrins in the wort so that we can keep that thick, chewy, luxurious texture in the final beer. Now, using this method, your efficiency will take a big hit. I'm calculating my mash efficiency at about 55% for this beer. Now, I'm okay with that because what I'm going to do is then use the second runnings to produce another beer, which you may have already seen that video that we used to do the low gravity starter beer. And I'm then going to use the yeast cake from that brew to become the starter for this Baltic Porter. So it actually does work out quite efficient in the way I use the grain bill and just 1 pack of yeast to ferment a big beer like this. If you're not going to use this party goal method, perhaps another way to get the most out of your grist is to do a full mash and then a full sparge and then do a very long boil to concentrate the sugars in the wort and elevate your desired starting gravity to that 1.073 region. For my water chemistry, I'm using the Brew Baltic Porter profile, which is quite balanced in its chloride to sulfate ratio. One other little detail to mention maybe is I am adding 2 grams of calcium hydroxide to increase the pH of my mash. When I'm using RO water, obviously it doesn't have all those hydroxide buffering ions in there. So what I've found is that when I'm doing these darker beers, and in particular these redder, and now into this Baltic Porter going into that more dark brown type beer, the grist is more acidic, so it's going to require a little bit of help to keep the mash temperature up inside my 5.2 to 5.5 pH zone. Alright, we're coming up to a boil here, just got to be careful we don't get a boil over, keep that foam away and keep some space for the bubbles to come through. Alright, I'm going to set a timer for 20 minutes and then we'll add our first boil addition. I want to give it a 20-minute head start before adding my 60-minute addition because we're going to do this one no chill. So the 60-minute addition goes in at 40 minute, the 20-minute addition goes in at flame out, and that way we account for the bitterness that's produced when those alpha acids are isomerized during that cooling down process inside the bag. Okay, 100 grams of Saaz hops. At flame out, I'm going to add 25 grams of Styron Goldings hops just to give this beer some little bit of hop edge in the finish. Then we kill the power and we let those hops settle. Once we're happy, we transfer our hot wort straight into our bag, or as I would recommend, a cube. I'm just using a bag today because I don't have a cube handy. You'll notice I'm wearing heat gloves. Be very careful. Remember, we're dealing with boiling hot wort, and for that reason I find a cube much easier to work with, both during this filling stage and later when you're trying to get your wort into your fermenter. It's much easier to pour out of a cube rather than these bags which flop everywhere. You might notice I haven't included footage of me trying to get this stuff into my fermenter. And the reason is it's very difficult. It's very difficult to record. It's very difficult to do. It's awkward. So take my word for it. It's much easier to use a cube. So once we've got our bag or cube filled, we put the lid in and set that aside to cool. The next day, or even a couple of days later, or weeks later even, we then transfer the wort into our fermenter, and once it's reached our pitching temperature, we can pitch our yeast. For me though, my yeast cake's already on the bottom of my fermenter, so fermentation will begin at whatever temperature this wort is entering the fermenter. That said, using this technique, maybe you could put your cube or your bag in a fridge to chill down before pitching so that you can get it at a nice low temp. I didn't, so I probably pitched my wort at 24 degrees and then let the temperature drop down closer to 16. So I was pitching fairly hot. Now that, plus the fact that I had yeast ready to go, plenty of healthy yeast, I think ended up affecting the final beer. As you'll see in my review, this beer ended up with a lot more fruity esters than I expected, and I suspect this technique of pitching warm wort onto a ready to go yeast cake played a big part in that result. So there she is, the finished beer. It's this dark, I'd say a light brown with ruby highlights. So let's dive in and have a smell. Oh yeah, the malt is leaping right out. We've got this toasty caramel, almost marshmallow malt sweetness coming off the beer. It's lovely. There's some fruity sort of esters in there, but they're fairly restrained. All right, let's dive in for a taste. Yeah, that's good. That's good. It's luxurious. It finishes dry, but it's got a big malt character. And those malt characters I mentioned in the aroma, they're there in the flavour, but those esters play nicely with it. You get some light red fruit, red currant flavours coming through, bouncing with the malt sweetness. And that's really nice. It's got just enough bitterness to balance it. In fact, you can just detect a little bitterness on the back end, but then it goes. Yeah, I'd make that again. I'm really happy with that. I don't think there's much I would change in there. Now, I was concerned about using 3470 because I thought it would be quite dry and dull, but we've got some nice esters there. I'm quite happy with that, how that turned out. Let me know if you give it a go. Tell me in the comments below. And if you're into dark beers, then why not check out this video in which I make an oatmeal stout.